And Mark has done everything. He's had his own radio show on Radio 2. He had a radio show in Spain. He was the wizard in Wicked for a couple of years, been in loads of straight plays. And it's just this joy to talk to, because he's full of life and fun. And he's like my brother, and when we see each other, we hug so much. I'm sure people think there's something going on, but he's very happily married to Jeremy.
Hello everyone, my name is David Hill and welcome to my brand new, shiny, sparkly celebrity podcast, Schmoozing, where I take a deep dive into the careers of some of my favourite people. Now, today's episode is brought to you by the perky team at 12A Studios. And here with me in the studio, controlling all things technical, is Jack Pallister. Hi, Jack.
Hi, David.
How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, David. How are you?
Yes, I'm good. I'm excited, Jack, because it is Easter week, which means chocolate.
Yes, it does, David. I'm very excited.
Yep, and I would like to know, Jack, have you bought my Easter egg?
I have indeed, and I knew exactly what to get you because for anyone who's listening today, what you may not know is that me and David both gave up chocolate and bread for Lent. So it's been a very long 6 weeks, a very long 47 days. And I knew straight away what chocolate to buy you. I think it's probably going to come from Marks and Spencer's.
Ooh, I'm excited. I'm very, very excited.
But I'm most excited about having some bread on Sunday because that has been the hardship of it all, is not having any bread. I'm starving all the time and I'm just going to eat sandwiches all day on Sunday.
Yeah, it's pretty tough not having bread. But I have to say, if someone gave me the choice for the rest of my life, no bread or no chocolate, I would elect the no bread option, Jack.
No, I'm the opposite.
Now, I want to explain to our listeners give them a visual picture of us in the studio, because for those of you that don't know Jack, and that's probably most of you listening, Jack is kind of famed in the world of light entertainment for the low-cut T-shirt or the low-cut top. And he's wearing his low-cut shirt this morning, but what he doesn't know, actually, is that the second button down is now undone, and it really isn't a good look.
I'm all about the cleavage, but that's a bit too far, isn't it?
Yes.
I'll just rearrange myself, David. There we go.
I think that that site definitely desires a gulp of gin and tonic.
Well, that is one thing we didn't give up for Lent, because I don't know what I would do without a glass of wine or a gin and tonic. And of course, we wouldn't be able to have our weekly gin, if we'd given up booze for Lent. So what have we got today, David? I'm excited.
Well, this one is, I would say, not for the light-hearted, because this is a flavoured gin, and it's by Whitley Neal, who I am a big fan of, but their flavours are strong. So if you like a really solid flavoured gin, more of, let's say, a cocktail, these are the ones to have. And this is a classic, actually. I think this is, in terms of the spectrum of flavours that we now have available to us, this is an absolute classic, because this is their Rhubarb and Ginger. I've mixed it with a Fever Tree light tonic because it doesn't need to be mixed with anything else. The flavour is in the gin. And as you will see, Jack, I have sliced a stick of rhubarb in half to create the stirrer for my gin and tonic. Oh, how incredible is that?
That sounds incredible. And I love a tart drink. That's my favourite. So I'll be enjoying several of those, I think, during the episode. Now, of course, as always, if you enjoyed today's show, please remember to rate, review, and of course subscribe so you don't miss any of our upcoming episodes in the next few weeks. Now today, we've got a very special schmoozing first, because the episode with Debbie McGee was so fabulous that we couldn't fit it all into one episode. So we've decided to split it into two sections, and today we will be listening to part 2. So sit back, pour yourself a gin and tonic, and enjoy part 2 of the lovely Debbie McGee.
I just want to ask you about those TV years, because I think it's really important to say in this interview that both you and Paul, you enjoyed the type of TV career that many of us would just dream of. I mean, you know, not only was it incredibly successful from all levels in terms of, I mean, the viewing figures for a start. I mean, the type of viewing figures that you got with your BBC shows. I mean, people could just, you know, dream about that now. I mean, to have that number of people watching that TV series. Obviously, I think at one point he was the highest paid entertainer on television. And you know, and you were enjoying this incredible period of your lives together, and it had real longevity. I mean, that's the other thing as well. I mean, those shows ran for 20 years, and people forget that. I just wondered what that period was like for you. It must have been, as you said, you used the word like a fairy tale.
Well, I think to me, my whole life has been like a fairy tale. It's what every little girl's dream is, and it was certainly my dream. And I, you know, I look back, and it's only now this year, really, and I suppose with lockdown, having more time, and I'm much stronger along the road of grief, that I can really look back and, you know, remember the things with such happy memories. But, you know, I think, yeah, you know, I had this fairy tale. I met the man that I absolutely fell in love with, and it worked. But also he was in my business, and we had a love of the business. Our passion was the business. Although Paul's was magic, it also was show business. We had that together. You know, I had a wedding that everyone would dream of. I was like in a Cinderella horse-drawn carriage, you know, and Paul arrived in a Ferrari, which I know is incredibly flash, but we both came from working class families. And so it was like, this was our achievement. It wasn't, you know, it was something we couldn't believe we could actually afford. And a great big wedding, you know, and then we lived this life, you know, from before we got married, of working on the magic shows, which was all year, because Paul was researching the stuff. He came up with a lot of the content or all the presentations himself. So it was an ongoing thing. And in, you know, in between all those bits, we would be invited to, you know, cocktails party at Buckingham Palace, or, you know, we were guests for the weekend of Prince Rainier of Monaco because he loved magic. And we knew that the shows were recorded, and in those days it was on video. And then a private jet would take them to Monaco each week for the royal family there to watch. And then we suddenly got this invitation that he had a magic weekend every other year. And we got invited to it, but as his guests, we didn't have to perform. We were just guests of honour. And I can remember the very first night arriving, and we weren't staying at the palace. He'd put us up in the Lowe's Hotel. It was a dinner, it was a banquet, and it really was a proper banquet. We went to, I think it must have been in the palace. I can't really remember now, but I can remember the table, you know, was a foot solid, this big wooden table, and the chairs were like thrones. And I had been briefed before on the protocol and everything, and said, oh, and by the way, you know, the prince is known for getting bored quite easily, so please don't be offended if he only talks to you for a short while and then he's talking to other people. So that made me more nervous, because I was thinking, how am I going to talk to a prince, you know, and here I am, this scatty blonde. But when I walked to the table, and there were 8 people at our table, but there were other tables in the room, he immediately put me at ease. And I was looking at the chair thinking, I'm never going to be able to lift that out because it's so heavy. Prince Rainier himself lifted the chair away from the table to let me sit down, and took my hand to help me to sit down, and then said, you know, good evening, and I've been watching you on the shows and things, and offered me the canapes. You know, he didn't wait for one of his staff. He was just very normal. So, and then when he learned that I'd been in Iran, well, that was it. We got on like a house on fire, because he wanted to know everything I knew about the Ayatollah and what it was like living there, and when the revolution happened, what went on. And, you know, so luckily I kept him entertained, shall we say. He didn't go off talking to other people. But, you know, we had this whole weekend, and Paul and Princess Stephanie were like two naughty school children playing jokes on each other. And at some of the shows they had, because there were magic shows all weekend, you know, a lot of the time they were sitting together. But if they weren't, she'd be looking around, making faces at Paul, and, you know, all those things that now I look back and I think, did I really live that? You know, wow. You know, so I just, yeah, I just feel this my whole life. I've been just so lucky.
I mean, what wonderful memories to have, you know, have those memories, Debbie. Incredible.
And Paul and I were both, you know, my friends say to me that I'm the most positive person they know, but Paul was as well. So it was a great combination, because we both always were excited about new projects. But also, we all know when times are good, we all can live easily. But when they're not is when you find out how strong you are and the person you are. And the different times in life that we did have problems, you know, the other one was able to rally on the person who was down. Or if it was a problem that we were both experiencing, it was our saying, like, you know, occasionally you go on holiday or we go and do a job and it isn't what you're expecting. So you could have a terrible time. We go, okay, we're going to have an adventure. And that meant our adventure was getting ourselves through whatever this challenge is, but we will have an adventure. And we always did.
Well, that's a great segue actually to my next question, because as you and I know, and anybody in our business knows, show business is a roller coaster, and sometimes you are hot and everybody wants you and you're in demand and you're on the television and things are flying. And that certainly has been part of your life story and part of Paul's life story. I just wondered what it was like when that stopped, you know, because that did stop, and there was a period where, you know, suddenly you're not the sort of the talk of the town, and I just wondered what that was like, that period when that all stopped.
Well, it was really interesting, David, actually, because we'd always said, you know, if you look at any successful person in show business, their careers have always done and dipped and come up and gone down. You know, Frank Sinatra, any of those, pick the big boys or big girls, you know, that happens. So we were always very aware that one day it would end. And Paul used to describe it that when it finished, he actually breathed out, because for all those years, he could never switch off. The only time he probably did was at Christmas, because we always took Christmas off. But even if we didn't have that many holidays, because if we were going away, it was usually to research some acts for the show. So you were still on and working. And I think because and particularly him, he was such a natural person. He wasn't a person in show business that switched it on for the cameras, or if he was in the company of the public, became Paul Daniels and a nice person. Paul was just always Paul. So there was no difference. So in that respect, that really helped, because we'd always lived quite a normal existence. So we weren't kind of lifted from these loads of showbiz parties and all this adoration to something we weren't used to, and nobody wants you anymore. We just carried on living, and we said, right, okay, we're not doing the TVs now. What should we do? What are we going to do? And actually, Paul's manager, who we then found out, who Paul had been with a long time, had wanted to retire himself, said, oh, well, you know, you ought to retire and learn to play golf and whatever. I'll get you a couple of cruises a year. So we actually did that for a year, and both of us hated it, absolutely hated it. You know, I love playing golf, still do, but that wasn't what I wanted to do every day with no other purpose. So then we started working on projects, and then we said, right, let's create a show to take on tours. So then we started doing tours every year and built up a following. And then because Paul, he was never, you know how lots of people in show business become big with a lot of puff. Paul wasn't like that. People thought he was, but actually he was terribly humble. He was confident in his own talent, but he wasn't, you know, when he was writing his autobiography and things like that. I've said, but you've left that out and you haven't said that. And if you'd be talking to somebody, I'd say, well, don't forget to tell them that, you know, like, for instance, we won the Golden Rose of Montreux in '84, and he beat a Bette Midler special and a Sammy Davis Jr. special. And the BBC hadn't won it for 22 years. And actually, I'm not sure they've won the Golden Rose since then, this big TV award. But Paul never boasted about things like that or anything. He just loved playing with his tricks and making people happy. And that's all he wanted to do. So actually, he said that when the TV shows went, he actually could live, because he could do what he wanted to do. And that's when we could do things like we were guests of Prince Rainier. We did lots of corporate jobs abroad, like in Cannes and places for American Express, which were, you know, doing shows at the Sportsman Club in Monte Carlo, which we couldn't do. We were always waiting for the BBC for all those years. So you couldn't plan anything, and you couldn't do much corporate work because you never knew when they were going to say we're going to record the series, but you're under contract, you had to be available. So for him, it was a huge relief. And people kept saying, you know, don't you want to go on and do another series years later? And he always said, no, if they asked me to do a special, I'd do a special, but no, I don't want to. And he really was happy, like being out on tour, doing the shows. And I remember one year when the touring shows that year hadn't done very well, and he was saying, what should we do? And then we had a friend who'd done a show in a village hall. So Paul said to this friend, well, do you want to book me 4 village halls, you know, in Devon or somewhere, so Debbie and I can go and do them and have a little bit of a break looking around the place? So do you know what? He absolutely loved doing them. And then the press put, oh, Paul Daniels has had to resort to working in village halls. But it wasn't like that at all. And actually, he used to give masterclasses to young magicians and say, you know, never be too proud, because if you've got to pay the bills, it doesn't matter where you're doing the show. The people will appreciate you just as much. And we actually, in village halls, we said, you know, we could get used to this. Yes, it didn't have the lighting of a theatre and the luxurious dressing room of a theatre, but the people were so appreciative that you'd gone to their village, because lots of these people wouldn't have travelled to a town with a theatre or could afford the money. You know, a lady would turn up with a picnic basket to give us something to eat, or some places, you know, they'd done a deal with the pub next door and they gave us a free meal before the show or after the show. And, you know, when you're in a theatre, you don't get any of that. You're lucky if there's a kettle and some coffee. And you know, David, what it's like. You eat fish and chips after the show because it's the only place open and you're starving. And they were, you know, they made you feel so welcome. And so I look back on those. We did a year where I think we did 4 in the spring and in Devon, and 4 sort of early September up in the northeast where Paul came from. And I look back and I remember those shows so clearly, and also that we drove around this beautiful countryside and stayed in some wonderful B&Bs, you know, and that's you have to, it's not all about going to the palace and the balls and the whatever. It really isn't.
Well, it's interesting because I have my sort of Paul Daniels story, my anecdote of Paul, and actually it's in a very similar venue to the ones you've just been talking about, because as we said earlier, we met in Edinburgh, and I think you and Paul were doing a show in Edinburgh. And anybody that knows anything about the Edinburgh Festival knows that if you are there doing a show, one of the things you have to do, I'm afraid, is you have to jump on all of these showcases that happen to try and promote your own show. So you end up doing, sometimes in a day, you could end up doing 2 or 3 other shows just to get your word out about the show that you're actually doing. And we were in a basement cabaret, very tired basement cabaret room, and there was a very big bill, and Paul was undoubtedly the biggest name on the bill, if not the only name on the bill, actually. But what struck me, because I was in the dressing room with I think you and some of the other artists and lovely Kev Orkian, and I went out, and there was Paul before the show doing close-up magic with the audience, and I was so fascinated by that. And I just remember it was a defining moment in my mind of Paul Daniels and his character and his talent. And I just thought, this is incredible. You know, this guy is clearly top of the bill of this show. You know, he's got all this legacy. He's clearly, you know, very, very well known. And here he is, while everybody else is in the dressing room chin wagging, he's out working the audience. He's already getting them on his side. He's already wowing them with this close-up magic that I didn't know he did, because, of course, I only kind of think of Paul Daniels and the big illusions. And I was fascinated by it, and I watched him intently work that room. And of course I thought, you know, so clever, because he's going to go out, he's got them already. He's got them before he's even stepped out on the stage. They're going to love Paul Daniels because he's already got them.
He knew his business. And I think what I'd also say in that situation, that is exactly why he would do it. He knew it was a bill of loads of people, and by the time they got to Paul, they'd probably have enough.
Yeah.
And so he knew how to get his audience. But also, David, I would say he would also do that if we were in an hour and a quarter long queue in Disneyland, or Paul would be queuing up at our local post office. He always had a deck of cards in his hand, or he would be, having jokes with people. And one of the things I can remember in Edinburgh, and we did everything, you're right, 9 o'clock in the morning, we were at the recording studio for all the local radio stations. And then, after we did the show early evening, everything else that came up, you had to go and do. I remember one night, actually, it was a midnight show, and it was a burlesque show. And there we were in the middle of it, coming on doing our magic trick. That's what Edinburgh is, isn't it?
Absolutely is. Yep, totally. No, absolutely.
That was Paul. He would just, going back to Edinburgh, it's what I started, I can remember, their Perrier Award for the funniest act.
Yes.
So many people that year would stop us in the streets and say, they really should give it to you, Paul, because yours is the funniest show we've seen. But of course, he wasn't considered a comedian. He was a magician. Oh, it
was fantastic. I want to sort of change gear now, Debbie, with the interview. Obviously, 17th of March 2016 was the tragic day that Paul died. And that marks his 5th anniversary of his death. And I just wondered what you think Paul would say and think about the 5 years that have gone since. So he's up there, he's looking down on you in terms of what has happened to you in those 5 years, and what his thoughts would be about that.
I just think he wouldn't be surprised because Paul knew what I was capable of with my talent, and knew that, although through the years it always looked like it was him, or that he was the one pushing us, which included my agent, I think. I think I've really surprised my agent since Paul died. And Paul, who was always so lovely and wanting me to work, would often say to my agent, Paul was very generous, always say I'll do it, and if Debbie can do it as well, but mostly they'd say no. So, and I think that he knew that I would cope, because we talked about that, and he also knew that I wouldn't just sit back and wallow in sorrow, that I loved working, and that I would carry on working if I could. So, and although I've surprised, I'm the one that's really surprised at all the work I've been given since he died. And it is, every day I pinch myself and I think, God, I'm such a lucky girl. But I actually think Paul would have expected it of me.
I can see that. Do. Yeah, I think that's a very clever answer, because I think, what you're saying is you're probably more surprised than he is. So how would you define this period of your life? So that the 5 years that you've been without Paul, how do you define that period in your head?
It's really, I can't really define it, except that for the first couple of years, you feel like you're lost in a forest and you don't know who you are and where you're going to end up. It's the only way, or you've been dropped in the ocean. And when he first died, I think at the very beginning, all I felt was like I'd been dropped in the ocean. I didn't know whether I could swim, and I didn't know where I was going. It was very like that. And because I've been a part of him in my personal life and my working life, in my head, I was really thinking, well, no one's going to book me now because, it was Paul that got all the work. Although I did loads on my own, David, and I did, it was still, he was the big name. And he was the one people kind of thought, well, he was the magician, rightly so. And he had more talent than me. I still believe that to this day. I've got something, but Paul was the one that had this charisma, this stamina, and this amazing energy for life. So what I will say is that what I just feel every day so lucky that not many people get to be part of a double act and then create themselves. You're normally always attached to them. And even if you try and do other work, it doesn't quite work usually, or you don't become as successful and you don't keep working. And I just think it's amazing that at my time of life, I lost my husband, who was my working partner, that all these things have come to me. And that people see me as Debbie McGee, not as a part of Paul Daniels anymore. And I still can't quite believe it. And it's in a nice way. They still associate me with Magic and Paul, but are kind of accepting me that actually I can do stuff on my own, which is quite incredible, really, isn't it? And thanks to Strictly.
Well, I just want to sort of harness that thought, because you just said then that, and to use your quote, you said, I definitely think I have something, and I would absolutely agree. And I want to go back. I'm going to put you on the spot, and I'm going to challenge something that you said 20 years ago. Because if I take you back to the Louis Theroux documentary that you and Paul famously did, there is a section in that documentary. I watched it all the way through. I think it was last week in preparation for talking to you. And there's a section in that that really kind of resonated with me, because you actually state, and I've got the quote here actually in front of me, you say, people like Paul, Bruce Forsyth and Jimmy Tarbuck that become stars have that extra special something that I don't have. And I just wondered whether you still agree with that.
Yes, I do. Like people like that, there are certain people that, and it's changing, because you can become famous for being on a reality program now, and people like you for a different reason, not for your talent. But those people haven't got it's not being old, because we have got people who've got it now, and some of the young pop stars I watch, I think, my God, yeah, they've really got it. And actors and singers and whatever, and musical theatre people. But that's what they've got on a Robbie Williams and whatever. Is this, in the business, we call it the it factor, and you can't really define it. And when Paul and I used to discuss it, because I can remember we went to see a very old artist called Eartha Kitt in her older years. And she was so electrifying in her performance, being a singer and a mover, that at the end of it, Paul and I, we couldn't speak. It was so amazing. We were so in awe at this powerhouse, that we couldn't speak. And that's what they've got. It's something from inside them, and I've got a bit of it. And that's not blowing my own trumpet. I don't know. I've been brought up to be humble. I'm not very good at blowing my own trumpet, but because people are telling me all the time, and my fans from Strictly, there's something about me they like, and it's men and women, which it's usually either the men or the women. So I know there must be something there, but they have something that they give their soul. They don't hold back. And, and I don't think it's something you can learn. I really don't. It is, they're prepared to cry or laugh with their audience. And I think that I hold back just a little bit.
Yeah, I'm not so sure, Debbie. I think, it's the only bit I'm probably going to disagree with you, because I certainly agree with everything you've said in terms of the rationale behind the psychology of a star. But I would argue that what we've seen actually in the last 5 years, and particularly with Strictly Come Dancing, was we've seen the star quality of Debbie McGee, and you are right. You definitely have something, and I think you hit on a very important point when you said that famously double acts, when one person goes, the act struggles and the other person really does struggle, or then is forced into retirement. And you and I could name a whole list of those people that have happened. Some of the most successful double acts in the world, like Morecambe and Wise. When one goes, it breaks the spell. And I think what we've seen with you, and particularly with Strictly, is, it released the spell in many ways, because you suddenly, you found your own. And that's no detrimental to Paul, because Paul was an incredible talent and a big star. But you found your footing. And when we saw you on Strictly, it was a joyous moment, because we see this incredible talent. And you were up against a lot of younger people. And there you go. You find yourself in the final. And then when you do the Christmas special, you win it.
I know. Hey, it's a dream, isn't it? It's a dream, David. I mean, I know years ago, some of my friends that grew up with me used to always say to me, why don't you push yourself a bit more and see if you can get that and see if you can get that? And I always used to say, no, my marriage comes first. And it always did. I didn't want to be off on tour without Paul. And we did bits. We had a few years where, I had a ballet company for a while and whatever. But at the end of it, I'd say, right, I've been there, done that. I've proved I can do it. But now I don't want to be away from Paul anymore. And I'd go back, and I went back working with him, because I always thought, you only live once. What makes you the happiest? And, careers are wonderful to be successful. But at the end of the day, you don't go home with them and sit and watch a movie with them, do you? And to me, it's just, family is very important to me as well. But to me, it was, well, my marriage, it comes before everything. So really, it wasn't that I didn't think I was important, but I thought, I do not want to sit in a hotel room on my own, and Paul sit in a hotel room on his own, because we're doing separate tours. And although I'd love to, even in those days, go out and do a musical or dancing or something, because that's what gets inside my soul, he was far more important. And what my friends are saying now is, aren't you just the luckiest person, Debbie, that you had this time with this happy marriage and this great career? But now suddenly it's almost like you're 20 again and you've been reinvented, and people are finding out about you, things they just didn't know what you had or what you were like. And I just think, it's kind of life has worked for me.
So what does the next 5 years hold for Debbie McGee?
Well, I mean, David, I know I always feel a bit guilty if I think I'm getting excited about the future, when so many people have lost their businesses in the pandemic, or lost people. So I really don't want to take away from that, because so far through this, I've been so lucky, and family have stayed well and things like that. Although my youngest stepson caught COVID in February, but at the moment he's all okay, so it looks like he'll be fine. But I think when the pandemic hit, I had a year's work, but it was all theatre, all really exciting. I'd been offered a musical. I was going on a Strictly cruise in the middle of that. And then I was doing a short stint in the West End of the musical that I would have toured. Then Panto with Craig Revel-Horwood, and not forgetting Sooty in Southampton. And then I should have been now doing another tour. And I'd been offered, in the middle of all that somewhere, last summer, a straight play for 8 weeks, playing some wacky psychic. Now, I've never done any straight acting, and I've never been in a musical. So gosh, what a year I had ahead. And then suddenly the pandemic hit, and all of it went, it just went, except the pantomime, which has been moved till the back end of this year. So through the pandemic, I've been working on a one-woman show of telling my stories, a bit like we've been doing today with some other ones, and funny things and jokes Paul used to play on me, and showing clips and different things and photos. And my panto is still on. all through the pandemic, I haven't had loads of work, but I've had bits and pieces of TV. And after this goes out, I think it's coming up in the next few days, the 27th of March, I'm on Celebrity Mastermind. I never thought I would ever do that program. But you know, when you've got nothing else in the book, this has been really honest. And they said, you know, you can raise money for your charity. And you're in the middle of a pandemic where no one can have fundraisers. Something does get inside you and say, well, all I can do is make myself look more blonde. You know, that's it. So there I've recorded it, so you'll have to look out for it. I've got a celebrity tipping point that I also did during the pandemic. And I've been, you know, doing other guest interviews on Zoom into different programs. I've just done a Loose Women one. So I've been kept going because although it's not been every day of the week, it's been enough that I've never had a week where there was nothing in my book. I started doing a podcast, Spill the Tea with Debbie McGee, like everybody else, but I started it as soon as we went into lockdown. So I was one of the early ones. It got to number 26 in the iTunes charts. So my agent rang me. He's going, I can't believe it, Debbie. Your podcast? I said, hey, hold on a minute, matey. You're meant to be my biggest fan, you know, which I've loved doing. And I'm sure you're loving doing these. And because you really get to know people, don't you?
Yeah. I mean, I'm only in the, you know, the sort of infancy of my podcast journey, but I've listened to yours and they're fantastic. And I, you know, anybody listening out there, if they want another podcast option, Spill the Tea, I could thoroughly recommend it.
Yeah, iTunes and Spotify. And I started them off, I think I did 5 where I was talking to myself, just telling stories from my life. And then I got a bit bored of talking to myself, if I'm honest. So I thought, oh, I'll ask some mates if I can interview them, you know, and got Biggins and Neil Morrissey and Ed Byrne and people like that, people I've worked with, and Linda Lusardi and Sam, you know, which was after they'd had COVID. So very interesting to see how they were coming out of it. And now I just love it. This week, or this month rather, I've got Bonnie Langford and Mark Curry, who people don't necessarily know, but when I was a kid, he co-hosted like an entertainment show with Bonnie Langford called Junior Showtime. And then he was Blue Peter in the years with Karen Keating. And Mark has done everything. He's had his own radio show on Radio 2. He had a radio show in Spain. He was the wizard in Wicked for a couple of years, been in loads of straight plays. And it's just this joy to talk to because he's full of life and fun. And he's like my brother, you know, and when we see each other, we hug so much. I'm sure people think there's something going on, but he's very happily married to Jeremy. So, you know, and I've got to talk to, but I found out things about mates that I didn't know. And one of the ones, and you're probably the same, one of the ones was Vicky Michelle, who I've known because Hello Hello and the Paul Daniels Magic Show, along with EastEnders when it started, we were all recording at the BBC together and we'd rehearse in the acting rehearsal room. So we'd all meet in the canteen. So, you know, that's what all the early people from EastEnders I know, and Vicky and Hello Hello. And I still always research them, even though I know a lot about them. But with Vicky, and I'm going to make people listen, because very early in the podcast, and mine are only about 20 minutes long, I found something online that she was absolutely amazed at and didn't know that anyone knew and didn't know it was even out there, was she had a very famous nanny who became a huge movie star.
Wow. Oh, I've not listened to that.
Yeah, this movie star, you know, went to work for them and was very young. And Vicky's mother had been an actress. And so she taught the nanny how to do her makeup, her hair, make herself glamorous, because in those days you had to be glamorous to get work, and helped her get work. And then she became this huge, huge star, which you will be amazed at. And it's not somebody we would necessarily, the youngsters would know now, but you will have heard of. Yeah. So there we go. So things like that. And it keeps, every day, it keeps life exciting. And I am a person that the only reason I'm saying these things as well is because if I can help somebody out there that's struggling a bit, and everybody at some point during the lockdown has struggled, how do you keep this excitement for life when we're all imprisoned and we can't be with our mates and we can't go out for a drink and have a giggle, and you get fed up of Zooming, because we do, not like this, but when you're with your friends, and everyone's talking over each other and you think, oh yeah, I'm giving up now. Is that what I found in lockdown is that did become more melancholy for a while because I had more time to think. And then I worked out that actually in the first lockdown, well, I'm going for loads of lovely walks and seeing my neighbours and things outside, but I'm not getting much done. Well, where am I being productive? And I'm quite happy to sit down at 4 o'clock and watch Tipping Point or something, So I then said, right, Debbie, you have got to get into a routine. And I was starting to sleep later and later. So, and I mean, I know you were fired up because you're getting your studios done and everything, but when you haven't got a project, it's really hard, I think. And I've always been a person, I've never needed somebody to kind of kick me up the bum. Paul and I have always been, right, okay, what's the next project? Yeah, should we start? But I wasn't decluttering. I wasn't doing what everybody else seemed to be doing. And I thought, right, okay, it's because you haven't got a routine. And when do I feel best? I feel best if I'm eating well and I'm exercising and I've achieved something every day. And then one of my nephews, so I said, well, I'm writing a whole list, but I get one thing done. And my nephew said, no, Auntie D, you've got to do a list, but you've got to make sure you've done 5 of those things. So that's what I do every day, and even some of them are so blimmin' boring, but it might be at the moment I'm chasing up BT, oh God, that goes on forever, doesn't it? But you have to do it. And that's why I thought, right, I'm going to start writing my one-woman show so that when theatres do open up, there's something there, all of that. And just even if it's saying I'm going to clean one window or do the ironing, it is amazing that mentally how you feel because you've done something. And one thing a day has to be something you do for somebody else. And we all put off that phone call that we could make to an old person who's on their own because you think, oh God, they're going to keep me on the phone for an hour and talk about nothing. We can all do that. And that's not being horrid. That's just being human. And so I started a thing where, I have to ring one person that I know would really appreciate the call that day. And so ever since I've been doing that, which is months, I felt different. And then I interrupted it got asked last minute to do the panto in Windsor. So I went into Cinderella, social distancing, rehearsing, and on the stage, we had these like cogs, wheels that went with the set. But actually, they were all different colours, so that you knew when you walked on, you had to be on that cog so that you were 2 meters from the person you're on stage with, and how it all worked when there were more of you. And, I was one of the rare people that got to do 30 performances of my pantomime before we were shut down. 2 audiences that I will never see again because you looked out and, 99% of the audience had masks on. And in panto, the children weren't allowed to shout out. They could clap and stamp their feet. I just think, hey, this is historical, isn't it?
Well, I'd got tickets for that show because it's directed by my good friend Carol Todd, who you obviously know, and so we'd got tickets because it was one of the few, if the only panto we could go and see, and of course it got cancelled before we got to see it. I have got a suggestion for you in terms of your one thing a day that you do for other people. Perhaps the one day next week, one of those things, you could come and do my windows, Debbie.
Didn't say I was any good at it. Thank heavens for a Karcher is all I'm saying.
Because they need doing, Debbie. They really. In fact, if you come over for the day, we could get you a whole list. We could get you a whole list of things you could do. So I've got a couple of sort of final quick fire questions for you before we wrap it up. One of them is bucket list. I mean, is there anything on the bucket list, life-wise or show business-wise, that you would love to achieve? I'm interested to know that.
What I would love to achieve. Do you know what, David? I've never, ever had a bucket list as such. Because what I've found during my life, because my whole being is what's meant to be is meant to be. So whenever I didn't get a job in my younger day, or even now, actually, I always think, well, it wasn't meant to be. So although there are lots of things I'd love to do, there isn't something I've got to do that, because I always believe life will bring it to me. And even the year before last, when I won Strictly, I was able to do it because I was doing panto at the Beck in Hayes. And it was a smaller one than I normally would do, but there was a whole reason I could live at home. I didn't know I was doing Strictly, but I also auditioned for a big musical in London that if I got it, I would have had to have started in the September, and they were going to give me the panto off and go back into it, but I didn't get it. And I actually thought, well, I'm not meant to be working every night and all those hours and whatever. I was sort of disappointed, but not really. And I thought I did the best audition I possibly could. But then, like 2 weeks later, I get the phone call about the Strictly Christmas special. Now, if I'd got that musical and got that audition, I wouldn't have been able to do the Strictly special, which also gave me much more of a profile and paid far more for my 3 weeks of working on it than I would have got in all those months in the musical, which I know sounds awfully mercenary, but sometimes I don't really always think of the money. It's always about the job. But, I always have to look at the positive sides. So that was it, if I got that job. So, but a bucket list is really not, I don't think I'd really like to do a movie, or I'd really like to do this, because what excites me about life is I always think there's something really good around the corner. I just don't know what it is yet. So I'll keep you posted.
Great. That's a great attitude to have. My final question before we move into, or before I take you through the green door, Debbie, is somewhat more personal. I just wondered, you are a young, attractive, gorgeous, very intelligent blonde. You keep saying scatty blonde, but I know that's not to be the case, and I think our listeners will probably know that. And I just wondered, do you have any thoughts of dating or finding love again in your life?
I don't think about it, David. I've gone out to dinner with quite a few people that have been absolutely lovely, but it hasn't led to anything. And because I really think that when you think, I really want to meet somebody, you never do. So what I've kind of learnt is I've learnt how to be on my own and be happy. And, if I'm lucky one day, that person will walk into my life, but I'm not going looking for it. It's, and of course, being famous, you can't go on a dating website or something like that. How can you? I just really always believe that life will be good, and you can surmount any challenge. I just always believe, and I know I haven't gone through things that people have to go through, like if you've had your leg amputated or you've lost a child or something like that. But I have gone through some pretty hard things in my life, but I've always believed I can surmount those challenges. And even if it is going through, my first 2.5 years after Paul died, the pain of grief is awful, and it hits you in a way you're not expecting. It's not just about being sad. It really isn't, because there's so much more to it. And so but I always believe I'll come out the other end of it. And because I feel really very, on this lovely equilibrium at the moment, I am getting work. I just think that's fantastic. And I've got so many wonderful friends and family that I really look forward to being with. And last year, I hadn't gone on holiday since Paul died, because I just didn't want to be away with nothing to think about. But I went on holiday twice last year, just before the pandemic, straight after the panto. And then in March, actually, I just got back from the Caribbean in time with 2 different lots of friends. And I thought what was really lovely is that I didn't need a man with me. I had the greatest time, and we never stopped laughing and things like that. And I was with couples, but I didn't feel the odd one out. And, when Paul died, lots of people said to me, oh, this is it. You won't get invited to any dinner parties anymore. It's all couples, blah, 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 blah. But that has never happened to me. All my friends still include me, even though I'm on my own. So, I just, yet again, I say, I'm the luckiest girl in the world.
I think that's such an intelligent way of looking at your situation, and an intelligent way, because you are right. and I've experienced this, when you are actively looking to find someone,
No.
it doesn't happen, or you actually find you find the wrong person.
Yeah, absolutely, because you go for not for anything, but somebody who's not right for you. And even thinking back to when I was a teenager and early 20s, when I was on my own, you meet people you have a sparkle with, but for whatever reason it doesn't work. And I've always looked back and thought, well, thank heavens, because if it had, I wouldn't have been with Paul and I wouldn't have had this life. So, like to my younger nephews and nieces now, when they're going through heartbreak, I just say to them, look, I promise you, in a few years' time, you'll look back and think, oh, well, thank heavens I didn't stay with that person, because they weren't 100%, but this person or this wouldn't have happened in my life, because that is. And I know they talk about the universe and what you believe in. I suppose I never really knew about all of that. I've just always thought like that my whole life. I've always, even though I came from, a working class background with parents who were supportive but didn't push, they were perfect. I always had that drive and wanted to achieve things.
Well, I think, what will be, won't it? And, you've already had what a lot of people don't ever experience, which is a really true life love story. So you've already had that in your life and experienced it. And we shall see, Debbie, what happens in the future. At this point in the podcast, I like to take our guests through the green door, and just to explain what that means is that I've started writing this story. I wrote a couple of paragraphs, and I've asked all of our guests so far to continue the story and take it wherever they want to take it. So I'm going to explain to our listeners that the story, in terms of the story I started to write, was really a quintessential English thriller whodunit, which starts with Henry finding the key to a door in the manor house he's been living with his family that has never been opened. He's never been through this door, and we're at, in fact, his father's wake. He's got the key, and he's now making his way to the green door to unlock it.
I've got it here ready, so I'm just popping it up and making it a bit smaller so I can see you as well. There we go.
And you can be as theatrical as you want, Debbie, with this section of the podcast.
Right.
Well, I'm going to go from Neil's section. I've just kind of given a précis of where we are so far. How could she possibly be standing there? She'd not been in this house for the best part of 10 years. Mum, stuttered Henry as the shock began to subside, but his pulse continued at an alarming rate. Henry was in two minds. Reach over to give his mother a hug, or have another attempt at unlocking the green door. Keeping his eyes fixed on his mother's face, he instinctively reached for the wedged key. I wouldn't open that door if I was you, she hissed through clenched teeth.
Henry's whole body was shaking now, but he continued with shaky hands to put the key back in the lock. It took 3 goes before he could get the key in the hole. His mother was nearly upon him when at last the key turned and he opened the green door. Henry proceeded through the door. He stopped in his tracks and he was filled with terror.
Brilliant. Brilliant. That's fantastic. Thank you, Debbie. Debbie, thank you so much for doing this podcast. I really appreciate it. I could talk to you for hours. I mean, I'm conscious with these things that, there is a time limit, but I could listen to you all afternoon.
Thanks, David, so much. Well, thank you for asking me. It's my pleasure.
Thank you to the lovely Debbie McGee, and please join me next week when I'll be talking to one of my dear friends and yet another Olympic gold medalist, ice skater supremo Robin Cousins. I'm David Hill, and this has been Schmoozing. Please don't forget to rate and review if you've enjoyed the show, and above all, please subscribe so that you don't miss any of our future episodes. If you're feeling really perky, you could also follow me on all of the various social media platforms. Just search for David Hill Official. Stay safe, stay positive, and above all, stay with me for more celebrity schmoozing next week.